My parents lied about a medical emergency to steal my $155,000 wedding fund to pay for the golden child's honeymoon. So I got married in secret and bankrupted them. I'm a 26-year-old female, and I recently got married to my husband, who is also 26, after a 6-year-long relationship. We had an intimate ceremony at his aunt's farmhouse property, which was not at all what we had envisioned. I had wanted to get married on the beach, where we share some of our happiest memories. My husband and I are both water babies, making a trip to the beach at least once a month to unwind and relax. It's a special place for us. I had even started looking for hotels where everyone could stay. Like any other bride, I wanted my wedding to be special. For the last 5 years, I had been saving money for a huge celebration. I work in advertising and earn a decent income. My husband and I have always lived modestly, trying our best to save for the future. We planned to book one of the best hotels with a sea-facing view, so our guests could have a fantastic time. It was meant to be a luxurious experience, but we had to change our plans and scale down considerably because my parents borrowed money from me a couple of months ago, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. Some context. My brother, who is 24, also got married a couple of months ago. His wedding was sudden, and they didn't plan much. He had been with his wife for about 2 years and proposed just a month before the wedding. Their ceremony was small, with just family and a few friends. I was happy for him since it was their wedding and their choice. A few weeks after his wedding, my mother reached out and asked to borrow $115,000. She told me my father had suddenly fallen ill, likely due to his diabetes acting up again. She couldn't bear the medical expenses alone and needed my help. She mentioned a special drug that doctors had suggested, but it was very expensive because it had to be imported, and their insurance didn't cover it. Concerned for my father's health, I decided to lend her the money without asking questions. I visited a couple of times, asking my mother to show me the medical reports, but she always managed to evade those questions. Whenever I visited, my dad was in bed, but he didn't seem very sick. When I asked my mother why he hadn't been moved to the hospital for observation and professional care, she said it wasn't necessary. Somehow, he needed a rare drug that wasn't produced here and wasn't covered by their insurance. I wasn't naive. After my first few visits, I sensed something was off. However, I didn't want to accuse them without certainty. That would look terrible if they were genuinely in need. I realized my brother hadn't visited our parents either. When I asked why, my father said they didn't want him to worry because he was young and should focus on his work. Yet, they were fine with me being worried sick. After a couple of weeks, I spoke to my brother on the phone. He said he would visit as soon as he got back from his honeymoon. That was news to me. I had no idea he had already left. My parents hadn't told me, and neither he nor his wife posted anything about it on social media, so I was clueless. When I asked why he hadn't informed me, he said he planned to surprise everyone with photos and stories from their month-long trip around Europe. He hadn't intended to tell me, but he felt the need to respond when I mentioned our father's illness. After speaking to our parents, he said they told him there was nothing to worry about and that they were doing just fine. My brother thought our parents might have exaggerated the situation to me, and I believed it because I tended to be neurotic. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt, convincing myself they might have been protecting my brother from the truth to avoid ruining his honeymoon. However, my brother then said he would have felt guilty for not being there if what I said about our father turned out to be true. It turned out our parents were funding his expensive honeymoon. That sent alarm bells ringing in my head, so I asked how much the trip would cost. He told me it would cost at least $125,000 because they were splurging on luxurious hotels and fine dining, wanting to make the most of their honeymoon. They would also shop for plenty of things, and even that would be covered by our parents. At that moment, I knew where my money was going. There was no medical emergency. There never had been. My parents had invented the whole story just to fund my brother's honeymoon, which was meant to be their wedding gift. I felt extremely betrayed hearing my brother brag about how our parents went above and beyond for him so he could enjoy his honeymoon, especially since they hadn't had a grand wedding. The money I had lent my parents was from my wedding fund, and I felt stabbed in the back when I realized they had given it all away to my brother. When I confronted them after the phone call, my parents said they had to cook up a story because they knew I wouldn't give them the money if I had known it would go to my brother's honeymoon. They said he had been struggling at work and feeling down, so they wanted him to have fun without worrying about money. Unfortunately, they couldn't fund it themselves without endangering their retirement. Their reasoning was that I was young, earning, and had many years ahead to make the money back. But they claimed it wasn't the same for them. They insisted it was just money and that they would return it at some point. For now, I needed to put myself second and think about my brother's feelings, as this honeymoon had rejuvenated him and rescued him from his depression. I couldn't believe it. This meant I would have to cut down on my wedding expenses for no reason. To be clear, I would have been okay with a smaller wedding if it meant my father's health wouldn't suffer. But this was not what I had signed up for. I was furious when they revealed the truth, and I told them they needed to pay me back before I got married because I wanted to use that money for my wedding. I had a lot of expenses to consider if I wanted a beach wedding. Although my husband and his family were covering some costs, I had to look out for myself as well. My parents had never planned to pay for the wedding. They told me early on that they could either pay for my college or my wedding, but not both. I chose college and decided to save for my wedding myself. When my brother started college, I asked him if my parents had made him choose between the two as well. He laughed, as if it was a ridiculous idea. I never brought it up with my parents because I didn't want to accuse them of having a favorite, even though it was clear they did. I was young and still needed their help, so confronting them would only worsen my situation. Years later, when I confronted them about the money they took from me and how they favored my brother, they tried to deny it, but it was evident. I told them they had to pay me back because I wasn't going to give up my dream wedding just because my brother was struggling at work. My parents could pamper him with an expensive vacation funded by them, but I had worked hard for 5 years and saved for my wedding. I wasn't going to let them snatch that away and hand it to my brother, but they told me they couldn't return the money in one go before the wedding. It would take them a couple of years to pay it all back. They actually expected me to be okay with that because, apparently, there was nothing more important than family. If I was willing to spend that money on a medical emergency for my father, then there was no reason I couldn't use it to prevent my brother from slipping into depression. Here's the thing though, my brother was never going to get depressed because of work. That's because he never took his job seriously, which is why he was bad at it and earned so little. He works in sales, and his income is almost all commission. If he's bad at what he does, he has nobody to blame but himself. He might have been a little upset about it, but I can guarantee he was never going to get depressed. He just didn't care enough about anything because he had been spoiled by my parents all his life. He wasn't used to working hard for anything, which is why he seemed upset about his job. That was all it was, but my parents blew it out of proportion, making it seem like he was genuinely bothered by his failures at work and needed rescuing. It was all a lot of baloney, and I tried to tell my parents that this wedding was incredibly important to me. I had already committed to covering certain expenses for my husband and his family, which would become impossible without that money. They needed to do something, but they told me there was no way they could return the money before the wedding, and I would just have to scale down or ask my husband and his family for help. I found myself begging them to return my money, but all they did was shake their heads and say no. They insisted they would return it eventually, but that giving it back to me before the wedding wasn't possible. I left their house crying. When I got home and told my husband everything, he was furious, more upset than I was. He was about to contact a lawyer, but I stopped him. I told him it would be pointless, because there was no written proof that my mother had wanted the money for medical reasons or that she ever said she would return it. Everything had been informal. There were no binding contracts or documents to prove a single thing. So even if we filed a lawsuit against her, it would just waste our money on legal fees. We probably couldn't even prove anything since we didn't have any text in our favor. It had all been verbal and off the record. As much as we wanted to go after my parents, we decided against it because it would be pointless. We didn't want to waste more of our money on a hopeless situation. Instead, we focused on how we would change our wedding plans. Thankfully, my husband's family came to the rescue when they found out what my parents had done. His aunt offered to let us use her farmhouse venue for free. We had always envisioned a beach wedding from the beginning, so his aunt hadn't suggested the farmhouse initially. But now that we were looking at other options, she made that suggestion, and I decided to check it out. My husband had seen the place before, but when I first walked into the venue, I just knew that this was it. It was beautiful, and even though it wasn't anywhere near the beach, my husband and I were content. His aunt was letting us use the venue for free, which gave us even more reason to plan around the farmhouse. I got busy with the wedding planning, which also motivated me to cut my parents off. I had made up my mind that they wouldn't be invited to my wedding. However, I was on the fence about my brother because he hadn't done anything wrong. He didn't know my parents had borrowed money from me to give to him. That decision became easier when he called me after returning from his honeymoon, tearing into me for humiliating our parents by asking them to return my money. He told me he had heard about everything from our mother and was very upset that I was being so difficult. Apparently, he believed this was no big deal. Even though he was the one who spent my money, he said that as soon as he could, he would return it to me. But I just had to suck it up before the wedding and scale down. That's when I made up my mind about him too, and after that, I didn't speak to either of them. Now that I didn't have the entirety of my wedding fund, I couldn't spend money blindly on a luxurious wedding. Honestly, I think this worked out for the best. The wedding we ended up having was far more beautiful than anything I had envisioned before. We had to scale down, but it was worth it. We realized that this day was supposed to be about us, and in our daily lives, we weren't the kind of people we were trying to portray. It would have been pretty shallow to spend a fortune on a fancy wedding just to impress people. We decided to cut down on the wedding costs and instead do something better with the money we saved. In a way, I'm thankful for how everything turned out because my wedding was still beautiful and dreamy, but it lacked the pomp and show I had initially imagined. It was genuinely a good thing because we were surrounded by the people we loved, celebrating our coming together. I think that's all you really need for a wedding, so I'm happy with how things turned out. I posted the photos of my wedding a couple of days ago. Everyone from my family who had been invited received strict instructions to ensure that my parents and brother didn't find out that the invitations had already been sent. I knew they would throw a tantrum since they hadn't received one. That's how we managed to have a private ceremony without them showing up or trying to bully me into inviting them before the wedding. But once everything was over and had gone smoothly, I didn't see any reason not to post the photos on social media. However, somehow they saw them and contacted me the very next day, demanding an explanation for why they hadn't been invited to my wedding. I was surprised they even expected to be invited, considering that the last conversation I had with any of them hadn't been pleasant. I had left my parents' house in tears after our last fight, and we hadn't spoken since. The last time I talked to my brother, he made me feel like it was all my fault, and that I was being dramatic. After that, I hadn't spoken to any of them, and they hadn't tried to reach out to me either. So, I didn't understand why they expected an invitation. Not only did they believe I should have invited them, but they were also upset about not being present at the wedding. My parents called me and added my brother to the call so they could all yell at me at once, but I didn't care. I found their reaction very entitled. I had already cut them out of my life, and I didn't want any drama while I was trying to enjoy my new life as a newlywed. So, I told them that after they had stolen money from me, I had to cut down on the wedding costs, and decided only to invite family and a couple of close friends. Since they were neither, they didn't make the list. After that, I hung up and blocked them, hoping they would leave me alone. But an hour after our call, my husband told me my brother had reached out to him to inform us that my parents were really insulted by what I had said. My mother was devastated, kept crying and almost fainted from how hard she was crying. That's all he said, but I started feeling guilty because I didn't mean to hurt my parents that badly. He might be bluffing, but I don't know for sure, and it's been making me feel weirdly bad since I heard it. Ida for not inviting my parents and brother to my wedding because they stole money from my wedding fund. Update 1. Hi. It's been a week since that last conversation with my parents and brother, and I've decided I'm not going to speak to them again. My mother can cry as much as she wants, but that's not going to change the facts. I had cried hard the day I confronted them about the money and begged them to return it before the wedding, but they didn't seem to care. They took it very lightly, so now I was going to do the same to them. You reap what you sow. I also told my brother never to contact me or my husband, especially my husband, because he had nothing to do with any of this. I didn't want my family to bother him with their petty antics. Then I blocked him again after that text because I didn't want my family to have any access to me. They had treated me badly all my life, but I wasn't going to take that anymore. I swear, if I could, I would file a lawsuit against them and get my money back. But that might be a long shot right now since we don't have tangible evidence. My husband thinks it's worth a try and that it might just work, so we've been considering it. He's been in talks with a reputed lawyer, and in a couple of days, we're going to decide what to do. Until then, I just have to think of a way to make them confess that they borrowed the money from me under the pretext of using it for a medical emergency. But then they gave it away to my brother so he could have a fun honeymoon. It's going to be difficult to prove in court, but I don't want to let them off the hook so easily. I deserve to get my money back, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure they return it to me, and soon. Update 2. Yesterday, I told my brother not to bother my husband with our family drama, so of course, he took that as a sign to drag him into this, even though it doesn't involve him. After we got back from work, my husband told me that my parents and brother had sent him a bunch of texts demanding that he speak to me and tell me to unblock them. When he blocked them, they took it a step further and actually showed up at his workplace. Apparently, they had been waiting for him right outside. As soon as they saw his car leaving, they started tailing him and honking repeatedly. So he had to pull over and wait for them to catch up because he recognized my brother's car and knew it was them. He also knew that if he didn't stop and wait for them, then they would just follow him home, and that would really bother me. So he decided to take one for the team and entertain their nonsense. When he pulled over, my brother got out of his car, walked up to my husband's window, and said they wanted to speak with him in person. There was a diner nearby, and my husband just wanted to get it over with, so they took a booth there for my family to say whatever they thought was so important. My brother claimed it wasn't fair for me to cut everyone off over some money and that I was overreacting. They believed my implication that we weren't family anymore just because they borrowed money from me was taking things too far. Since I had already blocked them, they knew they could reach me through my husband, hoping he would remind me that we were family no matter what. They wanted him to tell me I needed to act like it, instead of throwing tantrums over every little misunderstanding and acting like a brat. My parents insisted they would eventually return the money, but it wasn't possible for them to give it back all at once. They claimed they had already explained this to me a million times, and that I needed to be more thoughtful, because my brother was struggling at work, and my parents were about to retire in a couple of years. They were trying to convince my husband that this was all my fault, and that I was acting out for no reason. But my husband played it well. Instead of putting them in their place, he entertained them and made them feel like he was on their side. He told them he could try to explain things to me, but it would help a lot more if they reached out to me personally and sent a heartfelt message. So far, their tone had only been accusatory, but my husband convinced them that if they acknowledged their mistakes, it might calm me down. And those idiots actually bought it. My husband manipulated them into sending me a message acknowledging what they had done, making them think that it would prompt me to go easy on them and perhaps even apologize. Of course, it's all a lot of nonsense, because as soon as they send that message, we'll use it as an admission of guilt and pursue legal action. I'm actually really proud of my husband for handling this better than I would have. He's an evil genius, but he's my evil genius, and I love him. Update 3. Well, my husband's plan worked, and we are so pumped right now. My parents and my brother, like a bunch of idiots, sent me an email detailing every single lie they told and confessing to what they had done. Now that we have proof, my husband has given our lawyer the green light to proceed with the petition, and soon enough, we will be getting my money back. $115,000. That might not mean a lot to some people, but it means everything to me because I spent the last 5 years saving for the future. I worked really hard to get where I am today, and it took countless late nights and sacrifices. I'm not about to let it all go to waste just because my brother is lazy and my parents want to enable him. We will be suing them, and no matter what it takes, we will absolutely get my money back. We've also started planning for our honeymoon. It's going to be a short trip to the beach again since that's where this all started, and it will always be a special place for us. We might take a longer vacation in a couple of months, but for now, this will have to do. We realize we don't need to impress anyone or spend a ton of money. We can do whatever makes us happy, and that's exactly what we're doing. I also don't want to be like my brother, who posted a bunch of photos from his honeymoon after they returned just to rub it in people's faces. But now, he's going to be sued for that. It's really sad for them, but they brought it on themselves, and they totally deserve whatever comes to them.